Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stefan Spencer, and today I'm so excited to have Dr. Ramani Durvasula as our guest, and she is a world expert on narcissism. She's a psychologist, professor, author, and speaker. Her most recent book is Don't You Know Who I Am? How to Stay Sane in an Era of Narcissism, Entitlement, and Incivility. What a great title, by the way.
Oh,
And
thanks.
I am just so excited to because I've heard you speak at Genius Network, and it was just so valuable and insightful, inspiring, really. Because with
Thank you.
information that is actionable, you can make different choices and not be a victim, but be in charge of your own destiny. Choose who to work with and who to associate with. So I'm very excited to have you on the show. So let's start, first of all, with just a simple definition of narcissism, and then we can delve into it a little bit deeper because I know there are multiple types of narcissists. I think you have like 3 different types of narcissists. We'll get to that.
Probably expand that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So I can
Yeah.
remember at least 3, like the noble narcissist, et cetera. And let's first cover just a very simple definition because that, I think, will help get everybody listening on the same page.
Okay, so narcissism is it's an adjective. It's not a diagnosis. It's a descriptive term that usually signifies a personality pattern. And this is a personality pattern that is characterized by patterns like inconsistent or superficial empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, superficiality, chronic validation seeking, hypersensitivity, a propensity towards rage, especially when the person is frustrated or disappointed, and an incapacity to deal with frustration and disappointment. And then we also know, though, that this all coalesces around a core insecurity. People might say, well, why is this pattern? Why does it exist? Because the person inherently is insecure. And so all of these things are meant to almost to be what's the word I use? Almost like a protection against, like, imagine the inside of you is this fractured, insecure core. You're going to come up with things to wrap it up. So all this other stuff, the entitlement, the grandiosity, all the rest of it is like bubble wrap that wraps that insecure core to protect them from the world. And it really creates a lot of distance between them and the world. But believe it or not, they're also incredibly successful people. They tend to be the ones running our companies, our countries, our everything. And so this is where it's very challenging, that this very pattern that's not good for us is actually something we also at the same time reward.
Yeah, and they can be real charmers.
Oh, they're very charming. They're very charming. They're very charismatic. They're very confident. They're very well put together. They're very attractive. It's very hard from my position to be in this place where I'm telling people, like, yeah, don't be interested in somebody who's charming, charismatic, confident, and attractive. Really, like, I don't recommend it.
These
but
are
I have
warning
to say,
signs.
which is sort of silly, but I do tell people, like, charisma is one of those patterns where it's very engaging, but when you see things like charisma, enjoy it, but then there's almost like a red flag. Like, pay attention. What is this masking something else? In the midst of all this charisma, are they also being dismissive to other people? Because many times we give people who are charming and charismatic a free pass. I tell people that charm and charisma, you may want to enjoy them, but view them as a red flag that you should be on high alert looking for other patterns.
Right. So stay vigilant when you're dealing with
Stay
somebody.
vigilant. Exactly.
Gotcha. So if I could encapsulate all that into one sentence or even just a phrase that would help me to recognize a narcissist, what would it be?
They're difficult, arrogant, insecure, hypersensitive people who do not care about you.
Perfect. Okay. Wow. Great. Now, there are those different types of narcissists because some are really nasty. Like, I think you referred to them as malignant narcissists. And then there are ones who are just doing all this good in the world, starting foundations and building libraries and what have you. And they're the noble narcissists. So let's talk a bit about these different types.
So I often tell people, I think of it as almost like 5 different types of narcissism. We'll start with the worst one of all, which is the malignant narcissist. The malignant narcissist is actually somewhat dangerous. They're all the things I listed that a narcissist can be, but they can also be manipulative, coercive, exploitative, menacing, and even dangerous. The malignant narcissist, in a way, almost looks like a psychopath. There are some differences, which we can get into if you want. So there are differences, but the malignant narcissist is a dangerous kind of a narcissist. You wouldn't want this person as a boss, so they often are the boss. You certainly wouldn't want to be in a relationship with this person, but they can often be quite successful. But they're often known for example, running their work with an iron fist, people you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of. The classical narcissist, as I call them, and is also termed the grandiose narcissist, is sort of your textbook definition of a narcissist. These are people who are charming, charismatic, attractive, grandiose, entitled, VIP, look at me, tell me I'm great, aren't I great, come on my yacht, fly on my plane, come have dinner with me. Don't you know who I am? They're that person, and sort of your classical kind of blowhard narcissist. And that's often what we've classically thought of them as, sort of your show off, your salesperson, your carnival barker kind of style of narcissist. The third type of narcissist is something more subtle, and more attention is going here, and more people are like, no, I thought they weren't a narcissist because they weren't that grandiose, larger than life one. The third one is called the covert or the vulnerable narcissist. The covert narcissist I often call it the victimized narcissist. These are people who often have a tale of woe. Woe is me. Life wasn't fair to me. Life wasn't kind to me. And they have a lot of contempt for why they're being held to the same standards as everyone else. Like, I don't understand why someone as smart as me actually has to go to college and get a degree. I'm so smart, I'm smarter than the professors. Or they're very victimized. Like, why didn't the world recognize how great I am? I'm smarter than Steve Jobs. Like, I thought of the iPhone before him. He just happened to have the right connections. But if people could have really seen how great I am, and yet they're still sort of living a marginal existence in a marginal place, and all this sort of grandiose puffery is not coming out, and they're always seeming like a victim. They can be sullen. They can be very resentful. They can actually also look anxious and depressed, which is why when a covert narcissist shows up in a therapist's office, which they sometimes do because they're so bummed out at how life's going, a lot of times they're diagnosed with depression. Our fourth type of narcissist are these noble, or what have been more recently termed communal narcissists. Your communal narcissists are those do-gooders. They're like, everyone, let's be positive together, and come on over to me, and let's go rescue elephants, and let's go start a foundation, and let's go to the developing world and take pictures of ourselves with orphans. And I love people who love people. I love people who want to give back to the world. Here's the problem with the communal narcissist. The sole thing that's largely mobilizing them to do all these good deeds is the validation they'll get. So if the communal narcissist doesn't get enough validation for their good deeds, they get quite angry, frustrated, and kind of unkind. They don't seem so charitable anymore. They will feel like not enough people like my Instagram post where I said I was going to rescue whatever animal of the week they're going to rescue. And what's even more striking is many people will say that communal narcissists can be rather cruel behind closed doors. So the whole world will see the communal narcissist as this giving, charitable, big-hearted person who's generous and gives of themselves. But then when they're behind closed doors with their partner or their families or close associates, they're very invalidating and cruel and unempathic. And that disconnect means being in a relationship with a communal narcissist is actually really difficult because the world is telling you how lucky you are that this is your father or your mother or your husband or your wife or something like that. And you're thinking, oh my God, my relationship with them is terrible. The fifth type of narcissist is something I call the benign narcissist. And what I mean by that is narcissism's on a spectrum from, very, kind of not particularly vexing or problematic all the way to our severe malignant narcissist. At the low end of the spectrum, you have your benign narcissists who are largely superficial people who care about superficial things. They probably don't care much about your feelings, but they tend not to be intentionally cruel. They're great people to have at a party. It'd be fun if you're going on vacation with them and a group of other people. You'd never want to count on them in a crisis. They're never going to be helpful when your life becomes heavy. But they're not intentionally mean. And that's why they're sometimes confusing to people who feel like, there's no there, but like they don't ever seem to care about my feelings. Well, that's because they don't, and they're pretty superficial. But like I said, you don't experience an intentional cruelty. Like they'll spend like hours and hours and hours and hours making sure they get more followers on Instagram, sort of thing. That's like their raison for living. Like that's it. And then the final group are what I call the neglectful narcissists. The neglectful narcissists are people we tend to experience in relationships. They just don't care. And so if you're in any kind of human relationship with them, they just don't care. They don't remember anything. They don't listen to you. They don't notice you're alive. You could come in with a flaming baseball cap on, fire and flame. They won't even notice. And it can be very, very invalidating and destabilizing to be with a neglectful narcissist because they're so not attuned to you in their space. And so some people will liken it to almost like dying on the vine. Like they just don't, they're not even going to water the plant. And so it's a very empty kind of an existence when you're in a relationship with them.
Wow. I had no idea that there were that many kinds.
Yeah.
It's enlightening. So you must have had some sort of experience that sparked your interest in narcissists and narcissism.
Obviously some personal experiences, but when those personal experiences were happening, I didn't know that that's what I was dealing with. It was really only years later when I got into the work, I'm like, oh, that's what that was. And I understood my vulnerabilities. I've encountered it in family settings, personal settings, professional settings. I encounter it still every single day. In fact, I'm already an introverted person. It's made me even more introverted. Like any day of the week, give me a choice of staying home or going out in the world, I'll always choose staying home because these patterns are everywhere and they're so toxic. I find them upsetting because I work on it all day. But I also got into it in my clinical work. I was seeing it more and more in clients who were talking about narcissistic relationships. I was doing research on health psychology, like how health and psychology come together, medical conditions and psychology. And I was noticing it more, like I was noticing it very specifically in how badly people treat healthcare providers. And it was a subset of people, and it was the narcissistic individuals. So I got interested in it scientifically, clinically, and obviously it hit my personal life and the personal lives of other people I knew. And then when I realized it was absolutely, truly, and completely clearly a pattern, I thought, wow, this is amazing. It's almost like having X-ray glasses where you can see the next card that's going to be dealt in Las Vegas. Like, I'm going to beat the house. Like, I get how this works every time. And this is how it works every time. Once you get the pattern, you actually can save yourself a lot of time in your life.
Yeah. So there's a big benefit to having that pattern recognition.
Absolutely.
Even more benefit if you have pattern utilization so that you can make different choices. You don't just see the pattern,
Absolutely.
But then you act on it.
Yes.
Right? Now
that's the hard part.
Yeah, it is. Especially when you have feelings for the person and you're not wanting to necessarily walk away. Now, you used the word patterns. One word that came to my mind when you said pattern was pathology. Would that be accurate?
Depends on the situation. I think in many cases, yes. I think that, when we use the word pathology, it's obviously, I think, patterns that are not good for the person who has them or good for other people. That's how I see it. Yeah. So in more cases than not, when we're talking about narcissistic patterns, we're talking about pathological patterns for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Now, what percentage of the population in the U.S. would you guess, or would you be able to give us a number based on research of the total population? What percentage are narcissists?
When we look at narcissistic personality disorder, which is a specific diagnosis, okay, that you have to jump through a lot of hoops to give someone that diagnosis, that the research only suggests that maybe somewhere between 2 and 6% of the population has that. The reason that's so low is because many people with narcissistic patterns don't have the other things you need for a diagnosis. And that's namely that they're having impairment in their lives or they feel distressed. We can contrast that to something like depression. When a person has clinical depression, they're distressed. They feel miserable. They're sad. They can't get out of bed. They can't get things done. That subjective sense of distress is what pushes them over that long list of symptoms plus the distress equals the diagnosis. Okay. With narcissistic personality, these people are succeeding. They're the head of the company. They have lots of money. They happen to be married. Their wife, my husband, might hate them, but they don't know that. And they actually don't care. So as far as they're concerned, everything's hunky-dory. And they don't think that there's anything wrong with them. So they don't show up on that distress or impairment meter. So that's why that rate is lower. Listen, people have asked me to spitball this number, and I am literally spitballing this. I honestly think when we're talking about enough narcissism in a person's patterns so people can notice it, we're probably talking somewhere between 15 and 25%, like 1 in 4, 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 people, where this is a real problem. And if we really were liberal with the definition and included all those benign narcissists, we might be closer to 25 to 30%.
Wow, that's shocking.
Not really. I mean, if you ever go to Costco,
me, somebody
if you ever
who's
went
not
to Costco
really
on the weekend,
sure, especially now with the run-in on the the insanity around coronavirus, and we have to stockpile, I don't know, 10 weeks of diapers and stuff just in case, and it's just it's a little nutty. But is there a test or an assessment that helps to determine if somebody has either just narcissism or has the clinical definition of narcissistic personality disorder, which I guess that's in DSM, is that right?
Yeah. So in order to make the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, you would go to a diagnostic manual, and that would either be the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, or to what's called the ICD, or the International Classifications of Diseases, and that's actually just as, if not more widely used in the DSM. And in there, they just have a long list of symptoms, and they say if you have 5 out of 9 of these and impairment or distress, then you have the diagnosis. Now, what gets tricky, though, in other ways is to measure narcissism in those other areas. There is a scale out there called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. I'm not a big fan of it because I think it really only gets at the grandiose elements, and it also includes pieces like leadership and assertiveness. So in that way, it's calling out something that's much more like a puffed up peacock narcissism versus the more toxic pieces of it that hurt other people. So I feel like that scale is almost like what I call celebrity narcissism. It doesn't really get the interpersonally problematic piece of it. There's also a scale called the hypersensitive narcissism scale. And that particular scale is designed to get at the covert narcissism. I think it's a good start. I still think it doesn't fully get at sort of the resentful, sullen, contemptuous parts of covert narcissism. And here's the challenge. Not a lot of people will always cop to being like this. There's a lot of narcissistic people out there who think they're incredibly empathic, or think they don't think of themselves as entitled. So these are not people who have a lot of insight to begin with. It's very hard to assess a condition when a person doesn't have insight. Then, Stefan, there are much more complicated psychological tests that can only be administered by a psychologist. These are very, very specialized personality tests you'd only be given if you went into a psychiatric or psychological evaluation. It's very expensive. It's very time consuming. Certainly those can start to lend a slightly brighter lens, but even those, I don't always know that I agree theoretically with how they're capturing narcissism. So is there a great way to do it? It's almost like, honestly, sitting with someone for an hour, you tend to have a decent idea of who, if they are, and that's probably the best test we've got.
Yeah, so there's not a BuzzFeed quiz. Are you living with a narcissist? Take these 10 questions.
I'm sure BuzzFeed's tried.
They're trying.
I have no doubt they've tried. Yeah.
But it's not accurate if they have one.
No, probably not. No.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's differentiate the narcissist versus the psychopath and the sociopath.
Okay, so narcissism, as I said, was that long list of things: the lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, etc., arrogance, all of that. And it's all surrounding a core of insecurity. Psychopathy is a different animal. Psychopathy is something that has been actually researched a lot more than narcissism. Even the DSM doesn't have a perfect correspondence to it. There's a disorder in the DSM called antisocial personality disorder, but antisocial personality disorder, as it's diagnosed in things like the DSM or the ICD, is much more like a person who breaks rules, breaks the law, violates the rights of other people, and lies, like uses aliases, doesn't have a consistent work history, and all of that. When we look at psychopathy, we're seeing something a lot more chilling and cold-blooded. These are people who are very, very smart. They're very, very articulate. They're also very, very dangerous because they're incredibly resistant to stress. When the whole world is burning down, they are still the ones eyeing the safe in the corner to make sure they get it out of there so they get all the stuff. They're a person who does not crack under pressure. They're very anxiety and stress resistant. Well, isn't that great? Not really, because it's to the point where it feels like a cold surgical precision to it. They can be very calculating. They can certainly be very manipulative, very exploitative, very coercive. They're very much motivated by power, by profit, and by pleasure. It's very much only about them. And here's the key difference in my estimate between psychopathy and narcissism. Psychopaths not insecure. They're actually quite self-possessed. It's as though they don't feel like human beings like the rest of us. Narcissists actually are rather insecure human beings who behave badly because they're insecure. Psychopaths are almost devoid of the stuff that makes us human, the stuff like the empathy, the capacity for intimacy, the willingness to be with someone else's emotion. They devalue all emotion because they really don't have many themselves. They do not really have the capacity for empathy, but they're clever enough to know how to fake it to get something done, which is why they're charming enough to lure a victim in.
Now, I'm curious if, and I'm really overreaching here because I don't know this topic that well, but it seems like somebody could be born a psychopath.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But a narcissist is probably made through some
Yes.
sort of trauma.
Yes, and trauma, poor attachment, a little bit of a temperamental, like genetic, maybe like being a bit more of a tightly wound up child, that kind of thing. But it very much comes down to caregiver issues. And it could be frank trauma, but it could even be things like having parents that are emotionally neglectful or not emotionally available or very overindulgent materially, that sort of thing. So that with a psychopath, there is definitely mounting evidence that there are genetic elements to psychopathy and that there are also central nervous system elements to psychopathy, that we see differences in their brain functioning. The narcissism literature hasn't been as convincing in that space. And so it's a tough area to study in terms of the nature and nurture, because you'd really have to do twin studies or adoption studies to really establish how much of this is genetic and how much of this is created by the environment. Right. Because the bottom line is that you might have a person who has let's say a psychopathic father. So there's your genetic piece, biological father. If they are raised by that psychopathic biological father, they're significantly more likely to be exposed to things like violence and trauma, which could also be the thing that makes them vulnerable. Does that make sense? So it's that sort of a balancing act. And so that's where psychopathy is, again, quite chilling. It's quite, and listen, these are people who could be hired assassins. These are people who they can be brilliant surgeons because they don't sweat under pressure. When the artery gets cut, they're very calmly just sort of doing their job. And so some people will say these are sort of very cool people under pressure. They'd be great elite soldiers because the pressure of doing some of the most dangerous military work wouldn't break their spirit. So there's places into the world in which they fit. I would say an intimate relationship ain't one of them.
Right. Okay. And then sociopaths versus psychopaths?
So sociopath is a very complicated word. It's a word that actually doesn't have that much clinical meaning. It was a word that you see much more in the criminology and sociology literature. At our best guess, as people are sort of elaborating this construct of sociopathy, it's definitely less biological than psychopathy is one belief right out the gate. The other thing that some people suggest is that a psychopath actually genuinely doesn't get that there are things that are wrong. Like you don't go and just kill people. Psychopaths might be like, they were in my way. I'm trying to get something done. And then someone will explain the rule to them and say, okay, apparently you have a rule, but they don't get the wrongness of it, if that makes sense. Sociopath knows what's right and knows what's wrong and still violates the rules. Psychopaths tend to be very cool and efficient and quite smart. Sociopaths tend to be a lot more sloppy and messy. I always say a great analogy would be a psychopath would be a person with a long-range rifle on top of a building who does a hit from up there and gets away before anyone finds him. A sociopath gets into a bar fight because they're mad. Sociopaths tend to be more reactive with their anger. They definitely don't have, like I said, that cool efficiency. They may not even be as smart. And sociopaths are probably a little bit more likely to have had life histories characterized by trauma, neglect, and abuse. Whereas with psychopaths, it can be a crapshoot. There's people out there who are psychopathic, and we don't really always see it manifest in their early history, per se.
Gotcha. Okay. So if you could describe to us the absolute most malignant, awful example of a human you have interacted with.
That I've interacted with.
Could be a narcissist, a psychopath, or a sociopath.
Yeah.
Describe that person for us.
I could. This is a person who got tremendous validation from his wealth and from his work. He tricked everyone in his social world who respected him because he succeeded in this group of people and succeeded better than anyone else. And no matter how dismissive and cruel he was to other people, they always viewed it in the name of him doing his business and doing his good works and making a lot of money. Because he had a lot of money, he also gave a lot of donation into his community and into the community in which he resided. And people thought he was so honorable because of that. And so it really bought him a lot of cred, even as he was sort of a human wrecking crew. He would destroy people in business interactions. In fact, he really got a lot of joy out of writing deals and conducting deals in a way that the other person would get truly, like, really be left with nothing, like to the point where it would ruin their lives. Even though he didn't need to do that, he got pleasure, almost sadistic pleasure, out of ruining other people's lives. He was a very menacing human being. And at certain events, when he would find like a vulnerable person in his community, he would corner them and threaten them and walk away, leaving that person trembling. And because that community was so invested in him, people would never believe the trembling person. And he's somebody who had numerous extramarital affairs, gave his wife numerous STDs, and felt that was his right. He's like, I bring in the money, I have this big house. He would insist his wife do degrading things in front of his friends in terms of how she dressed and presented herself. So he just dehumanized every single human being he met. And yet, Stefan, if I went out into the world this person occupies, most people would say he's a good guy. And that's what's terrifying. This man lives amongst us. He's a terrifying human being.
Oh, my goodness. Yikes. Okay. And now you mentioned the word sadistic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So where does that fit into the definition of narcissist? Is that something that is common or
it's
unusual?
No. Here's what's interesting about narcissists. Because of that core insecurity that they maintain, and they actually even have more than a little bit of anxiety, more than you would think for being such kind of hard-headed, kind of mean people, they are not, as a rule, sadistic. It can feel like they're being sadistic when they're gaslighting you or doubting your reality or manipulating you. It definitely feels sadistic, but it's not the rub your hands together, I'm going to tie you to the chair and torture you sadistic. It's very much like they are always going to put their needs first. So the narcissist is the person who will have the one night stand and hurt their wife or husband or something like that. They'll do that, but they'll really feel entitled to it. And at the time they have the affair, they don't think about how much it hurts the other person. They just want what they want when they want it. The sadistic person would actually almost send a video back to the partner to hurt them. So sadism is very, very intentionally hurtful to the point where the person gets pleasure from it. And sadism is something we tend to see more in psychopathy, but not in traditional garden variety narcissism. Like I said, it feels sadistic, but it doesn't tend to fall under that clinical definition of what we call sadism, which is something that I got to tell you, other than maybe this, one person I'm sharing with you that I'd known of, it's not something I've seen that much. I do see people who want, like when a narcissist is hurt by someone, they definitely like to win. Narcissists love to win. It motivates everything they do. And they actually believe you can win in relationships. That's a big thing to them. So they really love the idea that their partner will get destroyed after the relationship ends, which is why narcissistic divorces can be very expensive. The narcissistic parent will try to take custody of the children merely to hurt the other partner with little regard that this will also hurt their children. So that feels sadistic.
Yeah, right. Okay. So you mentioned the term gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
For those who aren't familiar with that term, it's essentially like crazy making, right?
It's crazy making. It's a form of emotional abuse that consists of doubting someone else's reality, and most often their emotional reality. You tell them that their feelings aren't valid, that they have no right to feel that way, that they're too sensitive. And so you're basically acting like judge and jury on their feelings, but then denying their feelings even exist, which if you're having a feeling, it's like you're starving, you're really hungry. And somebody says, "Oh, Stefan, you can't be hungry." And you're like, "I'm hungry." And they'll say, "No, Stefan, you're not hungry, so we're not going to give you any food." Now imagine that, and it's your emotions.
Right. So that is denying the person's reality.
Mm-hmm. Exactly what it is. And it is cruel, and it is psychological abuse. And the challenge is over time, gaslighting can leave a person incredibly confused, full of self-doubt, incredibly anxious, and even depressed, helpless, and hopeless. And yet, it's a form of abuse that's not recognized by the courts.
Wow. I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wow. So, you mentioned in your presentation at Genius Network, I'm looking at my notes here, if you understand narcissism, you understand mental health. What do you mean by that?
So many of the patterns subsumed under narcissism, which include, and I'm not putting these in any particular order, anxiety, depression, hypersensitivity, dysregulation, impulsivity, are the things that make mental health the problem that it is. Because these are the things that get in the way of having healthy relationships, succeeding in the workplace, succeeding as a person. And so when you understand, it's like, to me, narcissism is a big multifaceted stone. And once you understand all the facets, you really understand all the big player themes in the world of mental health. And because so many therapists weren't properly trained, they really were. I wasn't. I can tell you that right now. Anything I learned about narcissism, I learned way after grad school. I don't even think the word was mentioned in all of my years getting my PhD. Wow. I mean, it's that much left out of the training. And so if you understand it, you understand the very themes that are really plaguing people who are struggling in their relationships. And the other issue becomes is that if you can understand these patterns, you can also understand people who are not only narcissistic, but people who are not narcissistic, but being impacted by these people. Our tendency in the West and in American psychology is if you came into my office as a client, Stefan, then I would look at what's up with Stefan. All right. And we'd make it all about Stefan, and you'd be the sole focus. Right. But if I can educate you and you can understand what's happening with someone else significant in your life, it could be a parent, it could be a partner, it could be a business associate, and they're having these patterns, all of a sudden, Stefan's anxiety, depression, confusion, and hypervigilance all make sense. But if all I'm doing is focusing only on your depression, anxiety, and hypervigilance, not accounting for the narcissistic abuse you're experiencing, I'm kind of barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, because as long it's actually as situational.
Yes, but a lot of therapists don't see it that way. They're like, what's wrong with Stefan because he's not coping well with this relationship? And my job is to say, let me educate you about this relationship. And I'll tell you, for some people, they're like, is that what it was? And honestly, sometimes in 6 weeks, they're like, I got this now. Thank you so much. Bye. And they're good. For some people, it takes a lot longer. It really depends on how long the narcissistic abuse has been happening.
Okay. Got it. So let's talk about building a case against a narcissist. Let's say that you're going to fight them in a divorce. You're going to face them in a business negotiation, and you need ammo. What would you tell the person who's having to face this? This terrible situation?
There are few things more harrowing than having to go through any form of litigation with a narcissist, because like I said, they're motivated by one thing and one thing only, and that's to win. You know, a wise attorney and a wise mediator and a wise person going into a court will say sometimes the win is simply like, let's bring this to a smooth and relatively quick conclusion. I may have to leave some stuff on the table, but if it can stop the suffering for everyone, I'll do that. That's not how a narcissist sees it. They don't like leaving anything on the table. So one thing that's very important with the narcissist is not let them know where your vulnerabilities lie. A common error people make, especially when they're going through a divorce, is, I'm going to fight for my children. My children are everything. My children, I'm going to fight to the death for my children. You know what the narcissist says? Now I know how to screw them. I'm going to go after the kids. Whereas if you approach it as like, you know what? There are kids. absolutely shared custody. In fact, I look forward to having a little time to myself as we come through this divorce when you have the kids. You know what the narcissist is going to say? Really? You think I'm going to take those kids? They're your responsibility. Boom, you may actually get more of your custody of your kids. You've got to think this through, that they want to hurt you. So don't let them know what hurts you, and almost play like, like the Brer Rabbit. Like, yes, it's reverse psychology. And because they're a little bit slow-witted in terms of emotion, you can often play this. In business dealings, it gets a little bit more tricky, because narcissists are actually really good at business, because they don't get into the messy business of things like empathy and things like that might leave you to leave money on the table. They tend to be quite savvy at those matters. And I always say to people is like, there are no such things as handshake deals with narcissists. You want to make sure that, as a matter of course, in your business dealings, you use contracts, and you use well-worded contracts from the beginning. And that for some people, they're like, no, I've been doing business with this person for years. I say, listen, I hope that one day you laugh that you wasted all that money on that contract, but otherwise, you do not want to be the one who is laughing for very sad and different reasons. So I tell people that contracts are often one of your greatest protections, because people don't want to believe it can be this bad. I would also say that the other thing that protects you, whether it's any form of litigation, is you need to document. And people find this kind of onerous. They're saying, oh my God, this is exhausting. I have to write everything down. Courts are not going to buy it if you walk in and say, yeah, this person was behaving badly, they're a narcissist. The judge is going to say, now the judge is actually going to view you as a bad person for doing name calling. And so you can't just, you throw terms like narcissism and psychopathy around in a courtroom. You need hard evidence. Somebody took advantage of you in business dealings, you got to be able to pull the accounting statements that show that. If they stole some of your anything, they stole your product or your idea or invention, you have to show the paper trail that indicates that. You have to be able to chart these kinds of things. The more of an evidence basis you can give, the more convincing you are. But if you sort of square up and say, this person's a narcissist and they're out to hurt me, that's not going to ring true in a court of law. It may be true, and it's sad, but that's not going to sell there. And that's why I say to people, sadly, you almost have to go into every business dealing, assuming the other person may be narcissistic, and contract it up in that way. And then if you don't need it, great, you don't need it. And so those, and I always tell people, don't rush into marriage. I mean, marriage is a contract. When it comes down to brass tacks, it's no different than buying a car or buying a house or starting a business. It's a contract. And if you're going to go into that contract too fast, I'm going to tell you now, it costs like $80 to get a marriage license and $700 to go down to the court and get that divorce paperwork. It's cheaper to get in than get out, and it's a lot more complicated. So be aware you're signing a contract. And if you're marrying a narcissist, you're about to get into a business dealing with a narcissist. You better have one heck of a good contract.
Yeah, wow. This reminds me, when you're talking about the business dealing side of it, that when you're an employer, you want to make sure that you have a witness, maybe the HR person or chief operations officer or whatever, in the same meeting with this person that you're about to give them a disciplinary action to. If it's just you and that person, then they could say, hey, there's sexual harassment or whatever, right? So you always want to have a witness, and you want to document the stuff as well as you described. But I would think that having witnesses and not being in one-on-one meetings with a narcissist, it would be something that you want to make sure that
1,000%, Stefan. And in fact, in a lot of places, people say, it's normal in an industry to have meetings over drinks. Never have meetings over drinks. Never have meetings enclosed in rooms that are not traditional meeting places. Oh, but we network at conventions and all of that. Then make sure you have other associates present. Yeah. Like, these are the things. I mean, we've seen many a company tumble down because of backroom meetings and all of that. And this is where narcissists will use isolation as a tool of exploitation. But in addition, narcissists are masterful at lying. It's one of the things they're best at. Trust me, they're a better liar than you. And so they're going to lie. They're going to lie on the stand when asked about what they've done. They really will. And people are like, but they took an oath. They don't care about the oath. And so I think people struggle with that. And so I agree with you. It's always having a witness, asking to have meetings recorded, and that everyone consents to it. Now, the problem is everyone does need to consent to it. And more often than not, if there's 10 people in the room, the narcissist is the one who won't consent to the recording. And usually you need all party consent, or you make that a condition of employment in that particular setting. So but they will definitely use the truth to their advantage. And a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, it was so clear what they did. When I say it, that they're going to cop to it, they often don't. And so I tell people, no meetings alone, no meetings in inappropriate places, no meetings where you're isolated, everything in writing. And I often say too, after you've had a meeting, quickly sit down. If there is no official minutes taker, write an email. In that email, say, I'd like to review the things we talked about at the meeting, so we have it for both our reference. Get it all down, send it to them with a read receipt, and that way you know that they have received it. And if they don't email back saying, well, I don't agree with point 2 or point 3, not that it establishes consent, but at least it sets a paper trail that you had attempted to always be very clear about what was talked about. It could be one more pillar that you might need when this all goes south, and it will go south.
Wow, this is great advice. I'm sure it's going to save somebody who's listening
a whole
lot of money.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I think that what also happens, and this is something I've spoken with groups of people you and I are familiar with, is that many times people who are successful business people or entrepreneurs, they actually have their own top note of grandiosity. In fact, I don't think you can succeed as an entrepreneur unless you're a little bit grandiose. And what that can create for a lot of entrepreneurs is a blind spot. And a blind spot where they think they can spot a narcissist. And they also, or they make excuses for arrogant behavior, because arrogance sadly tends to be a part of the entrepreneurial space. He's just being a guy. He's just that guy. It's nothing. It's nothing. And they'll keep making excuses because in some ways that kind of, extravagant behavior is sort of part of the world they live in. And then before they know it, they're being taken advantage of. If something doesn't pass the smell test, it doesn't pass the smell test. Pay attention.
Yeah. Speaking of smell tests, I learned this particular smell test from a good friend, Amy Africa. She described people as all having an orange, a peeled orange on their forehead. You just have to imagine this. And that you would try and spot whether that orange is juicy or not juicy. Okay, so think of an orange that it's just tasteless, it's dry, it's awful, right? We've all had that. And imagine the person is like that. So you don't want to hang out with that person because we are the average of the 5 people we hang out with, or something like that. But there's a third type. Besides juicy and not juicy, there's also the juice stealer. And I think of the juice stealer as the narcissist or the psychopath, somewhere along those lines, where they're just there for their own benefit, not to add value to yours. And they're going to use whatever they can get from you to their advantage in any situation, not just in the conversation or the relationship with you, but also to make themselves look smart and magnanimous and generous and all that sort of stuff, right? So if I hear the expression, can I pick your brain for a moment? I immediately think juice stealer, right? Interesting. Because they're not there to add value in my life. They want that cup of coffee. They'll buy me a cup of coffee. like, I can't afford that, so, thank you so much for that cup of coffee. I don't even drink coffee. But how dismissive to think that I can be bought off for the price of a cup of coffee. They can steal my juice, and then they can use it to make themselves look super smart and at the top of their SEO game or online marketing game. And it's just regurgitated knowledge, wisdom, etc. from me, passed off as their own. And so part of what Amy describes is the juice stealer's tendencies is to walk around with a syringe, a metaphorical syringe. So they're going to suck your juice out because you're juicy, and they're going to stick that syringe into their orange to add the juice to them. But of course, every time they do this, they're leaving holes in their orange, so they've got a very leaky orange. So they have to keep filling it up, keep stealing other people's juice, because if they didn't, they'd be reciting stuff that's no longer relevant or no longer up to speed. They'll be talking about SEO from 2012 or something, and they'll look like idiots to people who are in the know on this stuff. So they have to keep up this charade. And this is the kind of person you want to avoid like the plague. So That was a very helpful analogy for me. I'm always on the lookout for the juice stealers and the non-juicy people, but especially the juice stealers because they tend to love me. That's really annoying.
I'll bet, but you're in an interesting space, Stefan, because what you sell something that's very what I call transdisciplinary, right? Whether you're selling pumpkin pies, psychology, cars, canned wine, you can help someone, and that puts you in a particularly I want to suck your juice seat. But we all have something. I mean, the number of people say, no, I'd love to buy you. For me, it's I want to buy you a cup of coffee and get a free $350 therapy session. That's the game people play with me. They're like, oh, I really want to talk to you about an idea. And then we're half an hour in and I'm hearing about their marriage. And I'm like, oh my God, like I usually get paid a lot more, like you said, than that proverbial cup of coffee that I don't drink. So I think everyone's vulnerable to that. But I think this all resonates to what narcissists are often termed as. They're called emotional vampires. And that's what they do. They suck people's emotional worlds dry and people's blood and almost leave them feeling like vampires themselves. Because if you spend enough time with a narcissist, like it or not, you start picking up some of their patterns for no other reason than survival. And so that doesn't feel good either. But I think that it's the sucking dryness. And I like the idea of the orange with the holes in it, because actually the analogy I've often used is that a narcissist is like a bucket with holes in the bottom. And that's why they always need so much validation and what we call narcissistic supply. No matter how much validation they get, it's always trickling out of the bottom of the bucket. So they always have to go and meet more and more new people and have them say, like, you're so wonderful, you're so great, you're so good at SEO, you're so smart, I like you so much, what a great car, what a great house. They need it all the time. That's why they love social media, because it's a way they can get so many likes and so much validation from the convenience of their own home. And this is, like I said, I always say that where my work has been very interesting was I started doing narcissism work before social media came around. And when social media came around, and I remember it very well, my kids were still very small, and I remember thinking like, oh my God, this must have been what like people who knew about lungs felt about cigarettes. I'm like, this is going to be a disaster, because I thought the narcissists actually used to have to hustle up a little bit to get validation. They'd actually have to leave the house, because you couldn't just sit at home. Who's going to validate you? They'd have to get cleaned up, go out, go to their committee meeting or their church group meeting or their whatever meeting to wait for their validation. Now I'm like, oh, they're going to be able to just get this sitting in their bed. Like they're just going to get validation around the clock. And so it is. And here we are in 2020.
It's almost like having you have I don't know, kind of a power. Think of a superhero or whatever, and it's the reverse of kryptonite.
Yeah.
Right? It is. So it's like you put that in the room, and suddenly they get super powerful with it.
Yes, or less powerful. The idea of kryptonite, though, is also it takes away their power. So if and here's the reverse. Right.
So that's what I'm thinking about. The opposite.
The reverse.
Of it.
Yeah. So the reverse kryptonite is they get more powerful. But the kryptonite I'm offering people is that if you get this, if you understand this, and you can use what I'm teaching people on, then you disempower these pseudo superheroes in your midst. All of a sudden they go back to being Clark Kent.
Yeah. Now you used the term emotional vampire. You didn't use energy vampire. Can you just distinguish that?
I think as part of it is it's an older term. People have always called them emotional vampires, because what they do prey upon is that narcissists have a lot of contempt for emotion. They really do. They view it as a weakness. They don't like expressing their own, and they like exploiting emotion in other people. Okay. Once they realize someone's emotional, they're going to use that against them. They'll gaslight them. Oh, you're too emotional. You're so emotional. You're so sensitive. And that's why I say that, because what they do, though, is because they don't have an emotional world of their own. In fact, they're quite stunted in that way. They'll suck that out of other people by abusing them, by gaslighting them, by invalidating them. And so what they do is they take all that beautiful emotional stuff. In a healthy relationship, you can express that back and forth. It's interesting to think of them as energy vampires. I think it's by extension of constantly being emotionally abused and manipulated and violated and all of that, that over time you feel helpless, hopeless, and powerless.
Yeah,
and
worn
certainly
down.
You're worn down. Your energy in every possible way, not just your spiritual energy, but literally your human energy. People in these relationships are exhausted all of the time. they will say they start losing their will to live because they feel like nothing I'm doing is working, so why bother? And I've worked with many survivors of narcissistic abuse who had very severe cases of depression and felt like nothing they did would ever make this better. But the ultimate thing they needed to do, if they could, was get out of the relationship. But Stefan, that's not always easy. If they're in a very contentious, for example, divorce, and they have kids,
right,
they have to stay in touch with this awful person. If they're in a business dealing that's gone sour, they may spend years in litigation, and some people will actually lose tens of millions so they can just not engage in the litigation. As far as the narcissist is concerned, then they've won because they get to keep what they stole. The other person's like, I can't do this anymore. They walk away. And you know what? That narcissist will turn around and do it to someone else.
Right, right. And they probably had the foresight to, the narcissist probably had the foresight to think in terms of like, I need to prepare and have a prenup so that I can really screw this person if they step out of line.
1,000%. And the funny thing is what they do with a prenup is that they use a prenup as something punitive. I mean, listen, I'm not even that anti-prenup. Like, I get it. Like if somebody's made a lot of money or had a lot of family money and they want to safeguard some of that for their own heirs or something, I'm like, it is what it is. I mean, like I said, marriage is a contract. But it is amazing how sometimes these prenups are just plain mean. And if not prenups, I've seen also mean postnups constructed too. So it's this idea of using, marriage, an intimate, close space, using contracts as one more weaponized space within that relationship. Again, narcissists have contempt for emotion.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. You mentioned in your presentation using the hostage negotiator voice. Do you want to share in just 1 minute what that means?
Yes. So a lot of people, when they're talking to narcissists, get so frustrated. So I'll talk to you in not negotiator voice. Stefan, are you kidding me? I was at the meeting on time. I can't. Oh my God. That's not hostage negotiator voice. Now, if same thing, you're like, you weren't on the meeting on time, and say, Stefan, I understand that we're having a slight difference in how we're viewing the meeting time. At a minimum, the best we could probably hope for is that we communicate and use some planning software so we get, it's very much like, and most people when they talk to narcissistic people,
they're at the end of the rope, they're frazzled.
And so it is the hostage negotiator voice. It does one of two things. It either angers the narcissist more, or it does take away the fight. Because one thing the narcissist loves is they love the fight because they're a better fighter than you. They're always a better fighter than you. You walk into the ring with Foreman, you're going to get beat. They're the Foreman of psychological fighters. And so I tell people, don't try to fight with them. Do not try to fight with them, because if you do, you're going to lose. So what you can do is you can actually turn the bomb off and don't give them the satisfaction of the fight. You win when you don't give them the fight, because the fight is what they want. I go to George Foreman, I'm going to say, let's not box, sweetheart. How about we do a Mensa quiz together and see who gets the most points? And then we'll see who gets to punch who. I mean, you got to remember what your strong point is. Don't take a fight you can't win.
Awesome. This was fabulous. I'm so happy that you shared your wisdom, your brilliance, your insights with our audience here. What's your website so people can learn more?
Yeah. My website is drramani.com, doctor-ramani.com. That will take you to links to my Instagram, to my YouTube. My YouTube is full of probably over 100 videos on all forms of narcissism, narcissistic survival, narcissistic abuse survival. And that's Dr. Ramani, DOCTORRAMANI, and the same handle for Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all of that. Constantly have content coming out on how to help you survive these kinds of relationship spaces, as well as retreats and seminars that we're having all over the world.
Awesome. Thank you, Ramani. And
thank you,
listener. Now take some action and save yourself if you have a narcissist in your life. We'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Stefan Spencer, signing off.